Good morning and welcome back to another edition of Discover History here at the Florida Keys History and Discovery Center. I'm Curator Brad Bertelli, and today we're going to explore a little Henry Perrine history, which involves a lot of Indian Key, but also involves a lot of the Florida Keys as well. So let's before we get started, if you have any questions, Aaron is behind our fancy camera. So if you have questions, type them in and I can answer them now. Otherwise, I will be happy to get back to you later on this afternoon. So Dr. Henry Perrine is most notably known for his death during the attack at Indian Key on August 7th, 1840. But there was a lot of history before that happens. He was born in 1797 in Cranberry, New Jersey, and he loved school and was a very enthusiastic student, loved to study. But his father died when he was 16 years old, and that caused him to have to change his life because he needed to bring money home to help support the family. So Henry dropped out of school at 16. Sort of dropped out of school. He became a teacher and taught grade in a one-room wooden building in a town nearby, and he taught first graders to early teenagers. Back in those days, at 16, you were allowed to teach, but teaching wasn't really what he wanted to do. He did teach for 2 years, but then quit teaching and entered medical school because what he really wanted to do was to study and become a medical doctor. Now, in those days, there were two ways to become a doctor. You could work with an existing doctor in an apprenticeship and learn from one individual and kind of figure out, learn everything that he knew and all the techniques. But that's not the route that Henry wanted to go. He wanted to go to a medical school to be able to learn from as many people as possible. And there were not a lot of schools back in those days, but he did attend school and graduated at the age of 20. 1822, 20, I think. Anyways, after he became a medical doctor, he didn't want to set up a practice in an already existing, comfortable town. He instead wanted to go to the Northeast Territories, kind of on the edges of the American frontier in those days, and ended up going to Ripley, Illinois, and set up his practice. And it would be this destination that would eventually lead him to the Florida Keys. Had it not been, before I get to that, so he became a doctor and worked very hard. And one of the things that he liked to do everywhere he went, he was very interested in the local flora, the local plants and botanicals, and would always study the plants around him and inquire to the local communities, how they used the plants and herbs for medicinal uses. And this is something that would continue on throughout his whole career, this infatuation with plants. So as he's in Ripley, Illinois, he's working hard, business is booming, and he's also doing botanical experiments. One of the things that he would do, he would take the bark of a Peruvian tree and make a tincture of it, and every time that he would go make a house call, he would take a shot of this tincture, hoping that it would kind of fortify his immune system. So when he visited a sick patient, that he wouldn't, become sick himself. Another drug that he was working with was the poison arsenic. And this is kind of where the Henry Perrine path really forks. He became so busy with both his experiments and his patients that he hired an assistant. And one day he gets a call, to go make a house call, and so before he goes on his house call, he goes into his work office and he pours his tincture of Peruvian bark and takes the shot, and then climbs on his horse and takes off. But what he didn't realize, and what his assistant realized shortly thereafter, when his assistant walked into the room, was that the glass that Henry used had been used in an arsenic experiment and had not been fully cleaned. So he had accidentally poisoned himself. And The assistant knew, uh-oh, this is bad, jumped on his horse and raced after Henry to rescue him, which he did. By the time he caught up with Henry, Henry was slumped over his horse, but the assistant managed to bring him back to his medical office, and Henry Perrine recovered from his accidental arsenic poisoning. He didn't fully recover. Henry Perrine never fully recovered. He would be fine during the warm summer months, but once the temperatures began to drop, his immune system, which had been compromised, would begin to falter, and he would become sickly again. So every winter he would become sickly, and he decided that what he needed to do was to find a climate more suitable to his condition, and this began his movement further and further south as he looked for warmer climates. His first stop was in Natchez, Mississippi, which was a riverboat town. And so he climbed from Ripley, he climbed on a riverboat and went down the Mississippi to Natchez and set up an office there. It being a riverboat town, mostly what he did was mend broken bones from people in fisticuffs, but he also became sick with yellow fever, also known as malaria. And while he was sick with malaria, he again had been practicing and experimenting with botanicals, and he began to experiment with a new drug called quinine. And in the idea of physician heal thyself, he began, even though he's sick, and he has a nurse with him helping him to survive and combat this bout with malaria, he begins to experiment with this quinine, and as it was his habit, make copious notes. And when he did finally recover from his bout with malaria in 1827, this was a couple years later, he would submit all his notes, all his work on quinine to a prestigious medical journal, which I can't think of the name off the top of my head at the moment. And this would become the very most important paper on quinine for over 100 years. Now, a side note to the future of Henry Perrine, the nurse that helped bring him back to health happened to be named Hester, and he would go and name one of his daughters Hester shortly thereafter. Now, Natchez still was great, hot and humid in the summertime, but the wintertime would still bring chills, and he would still become sickly during the wintertime. So he, for a short while, moved south into Louisiana, which, the deep south, hot and humid in the summer, but can become cold in the wintertime. And again, that wasn't far enough south to help his ailing body. So what he did was he returned to New York, went to New York, where his family, his wife and growing family, at this point consisted of Anne, his daughters, Hester, daughter, I want to say Anne, I think Anne's his wife. Sarah, thank you. And Henry, yeah, the kids behind me in the picture, and so Sarah, Hester, and Henry Jr., and Anne, his wife. And while he's in New York, he and his wife are kind of poring over maps, trying to pick out a tropical or subtropical location for Henry to go practice medicine in, and so that would be more beneficial to his health. And during this time, the president also sent out an announcement that he was looking for 100 consuls to be spread out around the world, and Henry applied to become a U.S. consul in Campeche, in Mexico, on the Yucatan Peninsula. And he was given that position. And in 1827, Henry Perrine travels to the Yucatan Peninsula and ends up working actually in Tabasco, Mexico, and works as the U.S. consul there. He doesn't spend, most of his job was really documenting ships that were coming into port from America and documenting their cargo, and also ships leaving from Mexico going into America and documenting their cargoes. But that wasn't really a full-time job. And again, he was still interested in the local botanicals. And as he was kind of off in the villages looking at these botanicals, he also noticed that the local community, the villagers, needed medical help. So he would also, do his doctoring in the village, and they would bring him plants and seeds and flowers and tell Henry, how they're used. Now, shortly thereafter, the president sends a letter out to all these 100 councils around the world saying that, we need to find plants and botanicals that would be beneficial to America. And this is right up Henry's alley. He's already been making copious notes. And at this point, he begins, and he's the only one of the 100 who really, follows through on this plea from the president, and begins sending lots of samples, seeds, and some small plants back to America. Now, this is where, most people talk about, he sends them to Indian Key. And he does send a lot of botanicals to Indian Key, where his partner, Charles Howe, is located. But he's also sending them to Cape Florida, to the Cape Florida Lighthouse on Key Biscayne, to the lighthouse keeper there, John Dubois. And so now he has like kind of two small gardens going. The garden at Cape Florida is destroyed in 1835 by a hurricane, which is actually also the first hurricane documented to strike Key West and the Florida Keys. It also does damage the plants and some property on Indian Key, causes between $400 and $500 worth of damage, largely to citrus trees and some buildings. But it destroys the Cape Florida planting area. So now all his concentration is on Indian Key. Now, before getting in, I'm not going to get into the whole rest of the Indian Key story, and we'll save that for another day. But one of the plants that Henry Perrine is thought to have brought to the Florida Keys and South Florida is the key lime. And this is one of the things that people attribute to the Perrine legacy. But Perrine did not go to Mexico until 1827, and did not begin to send plants back until until several years later. But what we've learned, and just going through diary entries and articles that were written in the day, and even an advertisement in 1829 that was in a newspaper in Key West, that the key lime was already growing abundantly in South Florida. Dr. Benjamin Strobel journeys from Charleston to Key West in 1828. He's a big writer and does a lot of sketches of his journey and documents several large groves of lime trees around the Miami River. And then there's a really cool advertisement from 1829 by a man named James Egan, who is selling his property some property along the Miami River, and in that ad talks about all of these growing lime trees that rival any from the Isle of Cuba. So what we know, the key lime is indigenous to Asia. It does travel through Spanish conquistadors across from the Old World into the New World into Mexico. Havana and Cuba would have been the center of Spanish exploration. So we know that the key lime is prevalent in Cuba, and it makes perfect sense that the key lime travels to South Florida and probably into the Keys long before Henry Perrine ever ventures down to Mexico. A quick sidelight, what's interesting about the James Egan property that he sells, and he doesn't manage to sell, but James Egan moves to Indian Key and ends up building a two and a half story house on Indian Key that he operates as a boarding house, but he doesn't have enough money to keep it going, and Jacob Hausman actually takes over the property, the James Egan property. Hausman sells that property to Charles Howe, And so now Charles Howe has 2 homes on Indian Key, and Charles Howe becomes partners with Henry Perrine, and Henry Perrine ends up living in Charles Howe's other house, which was actually the James Egan house. So kind of bringing that full circle. And from that point forward, we will hit the rest of the Perrine story at another time, because there is a lot more to tell, a lot more to tell about Henry Perrine. Now, before we wrap it up today, we do have a great lecture coming this Wednesday by Key West poet and author Arlo Haskell. It's all about the KKK in Key West. We encourage you to sign up for this really interesting topic. You can visit our Facebook page. You can visit our website, keysdiscovery.com, under lectures, and you can sign up for this really great this lecture, free for all of our members, only $5 for our guests. And we hope to see you on Wednesday night for this great lecture with Arlo Haskell. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week. And those of you who we don't see on Wednesday night, we will see you back here on next Tuesday for another edition of Discover History. Thank you very much.